position or from her job. But disagreeing with figures you don't like isn't going to make the economy perform any better. In fact, messing with the data could easily make things much worse in the long run. As a recent article in the Wall Street Journal explained, quote, in the U.S., trustworthy economic data are central to determining how much people pay in taxes, receive in retirement benefits, and earn on some investments. Along with an independent Federal Reserve, they also underpin the dollar's reserve currency status, as well as roughly $120 trillion in stocks and bonds. That's trillion. Messing with job numbers doesn't just mess with job numbers. It messes with just about everything else that has to do with money in your life. And what's worse is that once you start messing with these numbers, it's really, really hard to fix. Economic institutions like the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Federal Reserve should be nonpartisan for a reason. The same article, the Wall Street Journal, continues by noting if new appointees are perceived as partisan, that would likely erode the agency's credibility. Market participants would take positive economic data with a grain of salt and presume that negative data masks an even worse reality. The ability of the Fed and other policymakers to respond to changes in the economy would be compromised, end quote. This is not a liberal institution, by the way. This is the Wall Street Journal writing about this. Furthermore, even if the moves are made in the future to try and correct things, we're always going to be missing accurate statistics or trustworthy statistics from the chunk of time that they were messed with, like right now. The data set becomes unreliable for all of time. It's very hard to get back on track. Joining me now is Jared Bernstein, an expert in federal and state economics and fiscal policies, a longtime economic policy advisor. Bernstein served as the chair of the U.S. Council on Economic Advisors under the Biden administration and the chief economic advisor to Joe Biden when he was vice president. Jared and I spent some tense time in his office in the White House because he and I disagreed on some numbers many years ago. And what he did is he called me in and said, we're going to go through this and work it out together. You and I sat in the White House and worked through figures because we shared the view that you can't mess with the numbers.
Exactly right. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. statistical system is the gold standard of the world. And, I think when some people hear the word statistical system, they think, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. And in fact, as you just showed, it has a lot to do with your everyday life. If the government is mismeasuring inflation and job growth, there's the risk of going down a path that China, Russia, Argentina, Greece, Venezuela have all gone down at great cost. Okay, we don't have to stipulate or imagine what it would be like if the business community and the global community, the global investment community, loses faith in our numbers. It would mean that interest rates would rise because anyone who's lending money to this country who doesn't trust the data they're seeing needs to get a premium. And in fact, we've already seen this increase in risk premia go up in some of our rates. So the Trump economic agenda has already proven to be an expensive one in this regard. If we continue down this path, it will become more expensive for average Americans.
This concept of trust, this gold standard idea, I remember years ago as an economics journalist when China would say they had X amount of economic growth. Well, we couldn't trust it. You've never been able to trust what China says. So you'd look at satellite imagery of were more factories running at a certain time, or was there more heat that was being generated? Because you got to work around to try and figure out what the truth is. We've never had to do that for American economic data.
We've never had to, but we already have. It's in the recent articles just in the past week. We've already had private folks in the business community saying we need to start looking for other sources of data. That is, they're not even waiting for obvious book cooking, which, by the way, we haven't seen yet. It's actually a lot harder to cook the books than I think the Trump administration realizes. The firing of the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, she doesn't see the jobs report until after it's completed. So there's literally thousands of people who work on these numbers, and you can bet that they have deep integrity and would report if those numbers were being fooled around with. But we already have private actors worrying about this outcome, and they're starting to say, what sources do we have outside of the government that can help inform us? And good for them. I think that's the right thing to do. That's a good cautious intervention. But the answer to that question is not much at all. You can't substitute for this system that's been in place for so long and is so thorough and so deep and so detailed and so very reliable by looking at a few private sources. So this is a really problematic trend.
And by the way, as somebody who held you to account and didn't want to take your word for it all those years ago, I ask you to explain to me why are numbers revised the way they are? Why would there have been a reason for such a big revision to the unemployment numbers? Donald Trump said it was to make them look bad, but there's actually a real reason for it.
Right. So every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects jobs data from tens of thousands of firms, hundreds of thousands of firms. And it takes a few months for some of those firms to get the information back. So the first estimate is exactly that. It's an estimate which makes some guesses about non-reporting firms. So the sample is incomplete in the first report. In the second report, it's a bit more complete. And in the third, it's the most complete. And so at each step of the way, we have revisions based on the incoming of more data adding to the sample. There is 0 months without a revision. And this is one of the things that I think the Trumpians, again, don't realize. Revisions happen literally every month.
Up or down.
Yeah, but up and down. Up and down, exactly. Up or down. Up or down. Yeah. And in fact, the interesting point about all this is because the Bureau has continually improved their techniques, the extent of revisions has trended down over time. Now, as an economy softens, there's actually some important information here. You saw that reflected in the Federal Reserve statement this week. As an economy softens, those revisions do tend to be a bit more negative because the models don't quite catch their turning point as quickly as it's actually occurring. So one of the things you can learn from the revisions is that the job market is softening, and that's what we heard from Chair Powell earlier this week. It's why he was leaning into a potential rate cut when they meet when they meet in the middle of September.
Now, listen, all the conversation about rate cuts for the last few months has been about Donald Trump wanting them and calling Jerome Powell, whom he made the Fed chair, all sorts of names and stupid and whatever the case is. Now it's actually a real discussion because of what you just said, because we saw these jobs revisions. Jay Powell said on Thursday and Friday, maybe we're rethinking the rate cut thing. So September 17th is the next Fed meeting. What do you think we should be looking for?
Well, before that next Fed meeting, there are a couple more data reports, including a jobs report for August. If that jobs report continues to confirm what looks like a softening in the labor market, you showed this earlier, the underlying pace of job gains is 35,000 a month over the past 3 months. That is too slow to absorb people coming into the job market. It's below the rate of job gains we need to prevent the unemployment rate from ticking up. And in fact, we've seen that occur. So a cautionary Fed rate cut makes sense in that climate. If the incoming jobs and inflation reports that they'll get before the next meeting are consistent, that's what they're going to have to do. But here's the key point, bringing this back full circle. You said it yourself. Simply firing the messenger doesn't change what's happening in the real economy, and people know it. This is why the Trump efforts in this regard are ultimately not just feckless, they're not going to help him. People know what's happening in the economy. In fact, I think it's the other way. The more they start trying to fire their messengers and cook the books, the more people are going to suspect things are worse than they think they are. So it's counterproductive. And thankfully, at this point, the data are still I think, reliable, and they are suggesting a softening in the job market, a job market that, as you know, was inherited by Trump in a very good, very strong condition, and their actions have led to a deterioration.
You're the perfect guy to have this conversation with. I always appreciate your time.